The Candid Frame is supported by donations by listeners just like you. Help us to bring you great conversations with great photographers. Support the show today with your monthly contribution through our Patreon effort at patreon.com/The Candid Frame, or click on the link in the show notes or the website at thecandidframe.com. Thank you.
This episode is brought to you by Squarespace. Start building your website today at squarespace.com. Use the offer code CandidFrame at checkout to get 10% off. Squarespace. Build it beautiful. This is Ibarianex, and this is The Candid Frame. Issues revolving around race and ethnicity have been in the news a lot, especially during this political season. But it's always been a subject of photography, resulting in some of the most interesting and sometimes controversial bodies of work. At its best, this kind of photography goes beyond what you see and forces you to think about how you see others and even yourself. That's the challenge offered by Stacey Tyrell's project, Bacra Bluid. Tyrell's family heritage has its roots both in the Caribbean and in Europe, specifically around Scotland. In a series of self-portraits, she transforms the physical markers of her face, her brown skin and curly hair, and creates characters that people would automatically identify as white due to their skin tone, hair, and clothing. The work challenges people to think about how skin color influences and changes how we perceive physical characteristics and who we assume someone is because of the color of their skin. Well, Stacey, welcome to The Candid Frame. I'm really excited to have a chance to sit down and talk with you. And thank you for making time for me today.
Yeah, I'm really happy to be speaking with you today.
Your project is really, really fascinating. I mean, I've seen a lot of photographic projects that deal with issues of race and identity, but yours is really phenomenal in terms of not only the ideas and the themes that you explore with it, but the way that you're doing it. Why don't you tell us about the project Bacra Bluid? And tell us what led you to want to explore those themes in this particular way.
Okay. I think that, first of all, like the project itself is like a culmination of, say, my experiences living as like a Black woman in North America, but then also being like a first-generation Canadian. It's sort of a strange combination of things as to how eventually like this project gelled. Like in my artist statement, like I speak about, like in school, just these sort of projects or discussions that we would have the odd time on heritage, and then sort of feeling left out of the conversation to a degree because the school that I attended was predominantly white, so I was one of the few non-white students, and sort of, like just having this sort of secret knowledge of knowing that you're more connected to them than maybe they or their parents actually think, and how that's like a direct reflection on sort of the historical and genetic makeup of most people who come from the Caribbean. But also, I guess like the approach as well is sort of to sort of co-opt this gaze that I feel that I'm under constantly. And, there are a lot of projects that deal with race, identity, Blackness in particular. And I guess my way of thinking of it was, okay, like I do want to talk about these things, but why not approach it from the other end?
Why don't you let people know what your background is, your cultural, and because your parents are from the Caribbean, but your heritage goes back to, so people can have a better understanding of what you're doing in the project. Why don't you give them a background of your family history?
Okay. Both my parents are from the island of Nevis, which is a sister island to St. Kitts and the Leeward Islands in the Caribbean. It was colonized, well, first Columbus came to it, and then it was colonized by the Spanish, the French, and then the British at different points. And on top of that, I have a lot of like great-grandfathers and great-great-grandfathers, and going further back that they're either from like Ireland, Scotland, or England. And I also did a genetic test a while back. It was coming up with like Scandinavian and all sorts of odd things in there. So, it really is like a mixed bag the further back you go.
When you were growing up, how did you come to be aware of that heritage? Was that something that your family took a lot of pride in terms of its knowledge of its family history? Was it something that was a direct result of stories that were told, images? How did your awareness of the diversity of your heritage come up for you as a child?
There were definitely like multiple sources. First and foremost, my grandfather, he has very fair, almost white skin, and his name was Cedric McKechnie Dean, and that in itself, that's a very, like if you were to see that name on paper, that's very specific as to what part of the world you might think that they're from. So it was always this story that he would tell of this father that he didn't know because what had happened. And, this is a typical story of the Caribbean and probably even with America, where my great-grandmother, I believe, worked as a maid or a cleaning woman in this one house for this plantation family, and I guess had an affair, for what it's worth, with one of the members of that household. And what had happened was that when my grandfather was born and he came out looking like a white child, the lady of the house wasn't too thrilled about that, and they were forced to live on another side of the island. And so for him, there was always this part of himself that he was never familiar with. Like he would sort of see it in passing, or I believe he said he had like a half-sibling, a white half-sibling that would show up from time to time, but, sort of always having this very distant knowledge that you're somehow related to these people. And I think especially for him, because his mother passed away when he was like I'd say maybe about 5 years old. Mm-hmm. So again, like having those connections out there, but then also sort of being like an orphan in the world to a degree, and, sort of just moving around from there. And then the other source that I would definitely say is my father. I was telling someone the other day about, like back in the 80s, we'd have these telemarketers call and, like selling these sort of like Ancestry.com type products.
Right.
And one of them was like, oh, did you know that the first Tyrell came over to North America from Ireland back in whatever? And my father would get very indignant with them and be like, don't you know that I am a Black West Indian? And that is absolutely not true. And all of these things, like take that opportunity to make sure that they knew that. But then also he himself being aware that further back in his family, because of certain features that either he had or his siblings had, that there definitely were white ancestors there. As to where they're from exactly, not sure.
Did you grow up early on the island itself, or were you raised in Canada for the most part?
I was born and raised in Toronto, Canada.
Okay.
And so, yeah, I'm a first-generation Canadian, but, it was like almost like every other summer we would go back to the Caribbean for at least like a month. Or so. So I was very familiar from like a very young age with down there.
I know I had a similar experience when I was young. I grew up in Los Angeles. My family is Dominican, but I was not surrounded by people who looked like me or who looked like me who spoke the language like me. And when I first went to the Dominican Republic, I was probably around 12 years old. And then suddenly being surrounded by people who looked like me, who talked Spanish, who ate the same food, was really sort of a shock to my system, because until then it had been also isolated to my family home or when I was visiting my cousins in other parts of Los Angeles. And it really was the first time where I started becoming aware not only how different I was, but that there was a community that existed beyond my sort of everyday. Mm. And I'm wondering about how those visits back to the home country sort of helped to start developing your sense of who you were, not just in terms of what you look like, but in terms of the culture that you were coming from.
I definitely say they were very important. I was also lucky that, say, outside of my school, Toronto itself has a very large West Indian community. So my parents were very engaged with their cultural association. But, I definitely was very lucky to constantly as a child, like go down to the Caribbean and be immersed in this world that to me it was magical, that my parents grew up in, where like there's animals everywhere and there's so many people that you're related to, like all on the same street, and just sort of like this I guess like land where for generations that your family's from there, whereas being sort of plunked in North America, it's like there's attachments there, and of course, like I was born in Canada, but it's not the same. But I do realize also that I have a tendency, I think because I think back on the Caribbean so fondly, that I romanticize it a little. But I would definitely say that all of those experiences formed a really strong sense of pride in being from there.
One of the things you talked about in some of the interviews is about when you're in school and kids would talk about their identity and an identity that you shared in terms of, as you mentioned, in terms of your great grandparents and such, but that when you came out with it, people doubted that you were telling the truth. Yeah. And that sometimes you felt the need to be able to sort of keep that to yourself because of that reaction. Tell me about that, because that's sort of a strange, weird thing to feel like you have to do, to be that self-conscious to the point that you feel like you can't admit part of who you are.
Well, it was surreal. I think when it really stood out for me, I think I was about 8 or 9 years old. I remember there was this one little girl that I was on the school bus with, and her parents had her in like Scottish Highland dancing and all of these things. And then I had told her, I was like, oh, my grandfather is half Scottish, and she called me a liar. To be called a liar. And first of all, as a child, you give a lot of credence to how your classmates sort of look at you. And then my reaction, because I already stuck out because of my physical appearance, was just to sort of draw back. Like I didn't argue back with her, like, no, actually I'm telling the truth. But I just more sort of got quiet and kept it to myself, because I was like, okay, like if this one child is calling me a liar, I don't want a chorus of them necessarily telling me that.
Well, tell me about your first transformation into one of the characters that you've portrayed in your photographs, and if you can describe how you came to decide on that first character.
It was a bit of a slow evolution at first, just because I was trying out techniques with the makeup and these types of things. But I always sort of had in the back of my head, I guess, like an upper middle class white person that either like that is sort of like this composite of a lot of the ones that either like through my daily life and life experience have sort of come into contact with. But that moment where all of these elements kind of came together, and getting the makeup right and then putting on this wig and seeing this transformation, it was so odd, and it's still odd every single time that I do it. And part of it is because subconsciously, even though I know that it's me, I'm looking at a stranger in the mirror, and then thus like my brain sort of flips into this mode where I'm viewing myself like that, and I notice my mannerisms get a bit different, and it's so strange. Like I've had like a spectrum of thoughts every time I've done it, from like, oh, that woman isn't half bad looking, isn't she? And that it takes me doing that to myself for me to sort of, like just in passing view myself that way, or I don't know, it's very odd, because also it's like I get to sort of try on this identity that I like. There's certain, I know the buzzword right now is like privilege that comes along with it, but like there's a certain like a laundry list of things that you get to take advantage of if you look a certain way in particular situations in society. And to just sort of try that out for a couple seconds, it's very jarring, I would say.
You've mentioned that, when people look at you, typically they look at first your sort of skin tone, but that there are some physical features that are probably you can probably trace back to your European heritage, and that somehow that gets revealed as a result of you sort of changing your skin color. Right. What were some of those things that you discovered that you saw differently just as a result of doing that yourself?
Well, one of the first things is that the shape of nose that I have. So from viewed like straight on, it looks basically like sort of like a generic African nose. But then from the side, the bridge, like it's sort of crooked and in a way that it's not. Like I could never really figure out like where that's from, and then also certain things about my bone structure. And when the makeup gets, put on and sort of dialing back a certain physical characteristic, like things like that really tend to pop out at me. And just even I've had some people say even the shape of my eyes and whatnot, though I think that they're pretty African in appearance. That just all these things sort of come together where you can just start to see that there's something else going on there.
And each of these characters is not. It's not just about changing the skin color. You create the characters by the change in hair, in terms of the costume that they're wearing, the setting. In some cases, tell us about all those choices. Do you sit down, because you say that you really have a clear idea of who this person is? It's not like there's some sort of generic, white characterization of yourself. Mm-hmm. Tell me of that. Do you sort of discover that as you experiment with all these different attributes that you suddenly discovered, or do you have a clear idea of who this person is, and then you start building, the creation based on an assumption that you've already sort of created in terms of who this character is?
I think a lot of the characters, I look at a lot of old painting or society magazines. I also look at like Town and Country magazine, and sort of like, it's a specific vision, I guess, of whiteness is what I'm portraying that is maybe more attached to like upper middle class and richer economic categories. But it's and a lot of like old photographs. For some reason, those really resonate with me. And I think part of it also is that, it's like part of the images that I create, the posing is a bit stiff and things like that. And that's sort of done on purpose because I wanted that the viewer is aware of the fact that the subject is aware of being observed. And that, to me, is very prevalent when you look at a lot of old paintings and old photographs, and that's because the amount of time that people had to stay still, especially in the case of like old photographs and things like that. So that's a bit of where I'm drawing that from. But in terms of the costuming and things like that, it's a mix of like both like what I'm seeing in those pictures and paintings, but also different things that then I add on from there. Like I usually start with probably like an age group or like a type of person, say particularly with, whether I'm like, this person's like a young mother and she'd probably have a couple children and she'd probably be dressed like this or probably participating in these types of activities. And then those activities sometimes will dictate what gets added to the picture.
It seems like hair plays a big role in that transformation. Tell us about that.
Definitely. I just remember, my mom is always saying your hair is your beauty. And I think that, Black women tend to use hair, especially like as an expression of self. What I found fascinating, just even going out and, purchasing some of the wigs that I've used is that, I'm always buying them from Black hair shops. And to a degree, they're an interpretation of white hair, but then by the styling and the color, it's they're purposely made to be desired by Black women, and then wanting to sort of have that look. And I feel that also just there's something just so, at least for me, it's a bit like visceral, this hair, like this big flowing hair, and these associations that sort of go along with it in terms of femininity.
Did you have any trepidation about sharing the work initially when you started creating it?
Definitely. It's like most artists, what I make, I make it for myself first, and then, I display it and I want people to see it. But at the same time, definitely with this project, I was very hesitant at first because, it's deeply personal, but it's also tackling subjects that make people feel very uncomfortable, and it's also, it's not pretty necessarily, a lot of the history that's involved with these things. I have to say, for the most part, the response has been, pretty good, or that it's sort of initiated discussions. But there are people that they have a very visceral reaction to what they're seeing, and that then there's certain associations certain assumptions made about me in particular as to why I feel the need to do something like this, which I have to say have been pretty negative.
So what are some of those comments that you're getting from people who start questioning, the impetus for on your part for the project?
I think that by trying to pick apart Blackness, in a bit of a novel way, I think people think that I'm questioning my own security and my identity as a Black woman, and that it has to do with, and you've seen examples of this even recently in the media, with sort of like a self-hatred in terms of how it is that I look, like this trying to almost like obliterate the African features that I have in order to that, it's sort of Blackness at the cost of whiteness. Or sorry, whiteness at the cost, like for, you know what I'm trying to say. I'm sorry about that. Yeah, so I have to say like that, and then also this very dismissive sort of, well, you're not saying anything new, like everybody knows that, and actually not a lot of people know that. Black people are more than aware of that story, but we make up a very small percentage of the population worldwide, and it's sort of one of those things that's just sort of kept within the community to a degree. But, it's something that I feel that like everybody, it should be common knowledge.
As you started taking the work out there, either to, for people that you wanted to see about maybe exhibiting the work or just simply to get their feedback, what were some of the initial reactions that you got to the work from not just, the average viewer, but for people who work primarily in the world of fine art?
I would say a lot of the feedback was really good. I think there is like an appreciation for what it is that I'm trying to do and how it is that I'm trying to discuss it. I'd say that there's certain pockets of the art world that are more receptive to it than others. And I think that that's also because like visually it doesn't fit into a particular style necessarily of what's going on with a lot of contemporary art, or that, and specifically I'm talking about I guess like African Canadian or African American contemporary art in terms of sort of the archetypes or sort of visual cues that are being used, because it's discussing whiteness and its relation to Blackness, I guess.
Let's talk about sort of the techniques behind what you're doing in terms of lighting and what you're doing in Photoshop. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so in terms of lighting, I'm doing a studio setup using ProPhoto 7A 2400 watt packs. It's a pretty basic setup where I'll have a large softbox as my fill, and then I have a beauty dish with a grid and a sock on it as my key light, and then just light the background separately. Just, like bring in the odd little rim light or whatever to sort of separate out the subject a bit more. So that's the basic setup that I use. And then in Photoshop, it's like I'm doing all the basic like sort of retouching, dusting type of things. And then I work a lot with the like liquify tool, like very subtly, because it is all about like the subtle changes in the subject, as well as different like masking layers in order to just lighten the skin tone naturally, as opposed to just like completely desaturating it or something that's like very obvious like that.
Was there a lot of hit and miss in terms of you finally coming down with the technique that worked in terms of what you're trying to do with the skin tone?
Definitely. I was reading, trying to find a tutorial. I actually did try Googling, like turning black skin white, and found all sorts of bizarre things. But I found that the makeup tutorials were the most helpful, and also speaking to a couple of retouchers. So it had to do with sort of like different like screening layers, and you can do like I think it's not the motion blur. It's just kind of like a light like blur layer that you can sort of just to obscure blemishes. That gives you like a nice palette to sort of work from, and then you can like build it up from there.
You talked about how it sort of has a sort of odd look to it. Is that part and parcel of as a direct result of the techniques that you had to apply in order to make that conversion of the skin tone? Or is that partly sort of an intentional in terms of the look that you're going for?
I wouldn't say that it's necessarily intentional, but a lot of it also has to do with the makeup itself. So when you start with a base of it's sort of like pancake style makeup. So it's not translucent the way that sort of like when we look at anybody else's skin where you can see little veins and other things going on under the surface. And then once you do bring those layers into Photoshop at different opacities, it sort of blocks it up even more. And I think that then that's what sort of results in a bit of like an odd look, which to me, it adds to it because I'm not necessarily going for realism, so I can take some artistic license with some of the elements.
Oh, very cool. One of the great things about having a Squarespace website is that you are never locked into just one given look. Once you choose a template, you have the ability to change it in virtually any way you want, and all with incredible ease. But even better, if you want to completely transform your site, you don't have to start from scratch. You can simply choose another template and try it out for size without losing anything that you've already created. Now Squarespace has made that process that much easier with its Squarespace Local Development Server. The new server allows you to locally preview changes made to the template code, rather than testing changes on a live website. Not only does this enable new ideas to be tested in a much more efficient way, it allows multiple editors to simultaneously collaborate on a Squarespace website. It makes updating and improving your website that much easier. Try it for yourself now. Start your free trial today with no credit card required at squarespace.com. When you decide to sign up for Squarespace, make sure to use the offer code CandidFrame to get 10% off your first purchase. Squarespace. Build it beautiful. In looking at yourself so differently, with these characters that you create, how does that influence or change the way that you see others? Like when you're walking down the street, especially in cities like New York, where you get to see, the hodgepodge, the whole mix of humanity that's out there. As a result of you working on this project, how has that shaped how you look and see other people?
Definitely. I think it's like I've always sort of been, subconsciously observing people, but I think profoundly, the more that I work on the types of projects like this that I've been working on, I can't get over the fact of just how, the closer I look at people's faces, just how connected we all are. And I definitely have grown an even greater appreciation for the diversity of features, but at the same time, just how, we aren't really that much removed from each other.
You study at the Ontario College of Art and Design. You study photography there. Mm-hmm. When did you discover that photography was really going to be what you wanted to do in your life? Did you discover that as a result of going there, or did you already have a clear vision that photography was what you wanted to practice?
I already had a clear vision going into Ontario College of Art. I had started taking photos when I was really small. My father always had a camera around. In high school, it was one of those things that just sort of kept me out of trouble. It's like any teenager. I had a lot of other things going on in my, everyday personal life. And that was the one thing that sort of kept me centered. I always had a camera, and I made a little darkroom in my basement. And it was a way to also socially engage with people that a camera sort of gives you an excuse sometimes to come up to someone. Mm-hmm. And approach them being photographed. And so by the time that then it was time for college, I was already in love with the medium, and it just seemed like it was a natural transition to then study it in post-secondary education.
For a lot of people, when they go there, when they go to college to study photography specifically, sometimes it can be the sort of the linchpin, right, from which all the work that they do begins. But for others, it happens after they're done, because somehow going out into the real world, that all of a sudden provides the seeds of what their life's work ends up being about. Not so specifically about this project, but just in general in terms of the photographic work that you did during school and after school. Can you tell us about sort of basically when you began to sort of find your voice photographically, whether it was then or subsequently, and why that experience in Ontario was so important?
I think that, first of all, by studying photography, you sort of get trained in a language and a way of looking at things a bit more critically than just taking a pretty picture. And for me, towards the end of school, when I was creating, I got really putting a lot of thought and effort into a particular project in like a fine art context, was when that sort of cemented the fact that in some capacity, once I left university, that this is what I wanted to do. And then when I graduated, what I found was that trying to make work, but sort of being disconnected from a photographic community, it sort of ground me down. And I hit a point where I actually kind of got a bit divorced from photography. And I think that in that separation where just because of like life events and then also how I was like feeling about and making less and less time to actually do something that like I absolutely loved and wanted to dedicate my life to, like finally recognizing that loss is when I came back to it. And that's when things really started to gel for me. I was always like the images when I go back to the Caribbean and things like that, like those are things that I was always working on, but it wasn't until like I recognized that loss and then decided that I was going to make a wholehearted effort into re-immersing myself back into this medium and fine art in particular that I love so much is when these other ideas started to blossom just out of my mind in terms of with the self-portrait projects and things like that.
Was part of that time just involved with you trying to just eke out a living, and that the demands of that are what kind of took you away from focusing on your own work? Is that part of the story?
It's part of it. And I think that what it was how I was approaching it as well, because in terms of work, I was trying to get work in a commercial context, mm-hmm. and then sort of saying to myself, then I want to be a commercial photographer. And that's how I would be a photographer going forward for the rest of my life. Just because there's up until very recently, there was always this mentality that's like, you're either one or the other. Mm-hmm. It's like you either dedicate everything to being a commercial shooter or you're a fine art photographer and you need to go and get a job teaching photography or something like that to supplement what it is that you're doing. Once I realized that, it doesn't have to be this way, which it took years and years and years and years of working in commercial photography in an assisting capacity to realize that even though the end goal was to become an independent, like commercial photographer, that wasn't where the passion lay. And mm-hmm. that's, again, like where I started feeling that sense of loss for the fine art aspect of things that really sort of fed my soul, which is then when I decided, you can have a day job, but like this is the fine art stuff is what's really important to me.
It's a hard situation to be in.
Yeah.
Right. Because you're thinking about, your financial obligations.
Yep.
And you're thinking about, well, I need to make a living and I need to do this. But in order to be able to really pursue what your passion is that you have to be willing to let something go and to have some sort of faith that things will work out. But it's frightening being in those moments. And I think that's often what keeps people from making those leaps of faith. What do you attribute your ability to finally be able to make that choice rather than still just like plow through and trying to make something that wasn't working and trying to make something that's not working work?
I think by nature I am pretty stubborn. So there was always sort of that nugget of, just kind of wanting to do what I wanted to do anyway. But again, heeding the advice of, and, for obvious reasons, like what makes the most sense, like putting food on the table, supporting yourself. And how do you build like a career that makes, I guess, sense? I do have like a deep-seated faith in in things working out, but at the same time, like you just said, it's hard when reality really starts coming up in your face, and you're faced with, do I choose this or do I choose that? And I think in my case, it was like I made a bit of the wrong choice in terms of ignoring the more artistic side of it and going for the more practical commercial side of things, where you can make a more straightforward living. But ultimately, then just realizing that I had to sort of go with my gut.
And what were some of the decisions that you made that really helped you finally sort of make that leap and start succeeding in the ways that you had wanted to?
I think a large part of it was also not being afraid to actually try out things. So, how else would I really know that, being a wedding photographer isn't my passion, or, just being a full-time still life shooter isn't my passion. It wasn't until actually like assisting on those shoots or going out and, like working for different companies, sort of doing these types of things, did I find out that wasn't the right fit for me. Because all of us can sort of sit there and think about the possible outcomes of things, but sometimes the practicality of actually trying out different things and not being afraid to try them out is just priceless.
Are you represented? Is that part of how you are, creating a living for yourself with your fine artwork?
Right now I am with a gallery in Toronto called General Hardware. But I'm not exclusively represented by anyone. And I think that like sort of the age that we live in with social media and all of these things have allowed me to, have my work sort of get out there and other people bump into it over the internet. But I predominantly make my living just working in sort of like production aspects of photography. And because I have like set hours, then I'm able to sort of mold my schedule around that. So basically I'm a free agent.
Oh, okay.
That's what I'm saying.
So you've been living in New York, you said before, for about 12 years, but you still go back to Canada. Is that true, or a complete New Yorker at this point?
I definitely do go back to Toronto a couple times a year, but I do consider myself a New Yorker now at this point. So
tell us about that move, because, as you said, you were born and raised in Canada, and New York is certainly a big hub for photography, but it's a tough city.
It's a very tough city.
So tell us about the choice to make that move and how you manage it.
I think what was the catalyst for me wanting to change and then trying to transition to New York was that I was working at a 1-hour photo lab in the mall in the suburb where my mother lives, and in finding that incredibly depressing. And the fact that, it's like I had a degree in this subject matter and I couldn't really get that much work in it except for, like helping with weddings on the weekends and things like that. And then I really sat and thought about like, okay, like where's the action at? Like, where is it really happening? And, it's like New York definitely comes up in that, along with like Paris, London, Los Angeles, and like those sort of like major hubs. It really like that feeling of just feeling like not even that you're not going anywhere, but that it's like you can just sort of coast along like this forever, just willing to be uncomfortable. And, I started trying to contact photographers that I could intern for. And, like one got back to me and I just kind of went for it. And, from the time that I got down here, one thing just sort of led to another. And that really sort of drove me forward in my career in the photo industry.
Rejection is a big part of being a photographer. When you choose to put out really personal work like this series has been, it's really hard not to put your heart on your sleeve. How do you sort of gird yourself up for when you're putting your work out there, either not just in social media, but if you're doing a portfolio review or you're going to someone to represent, to look at your work? How do you sort of contend with the fact that you may sometimes hear things that you aren't expecting or don't like? You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I sort of equated. It's pretty similar to being like an actor or something like another profession like that, where you have to know if you truly believe that what it is that like you've done is good and that there is merit in it, and that you've created the work for yourself, and that no matter what someone else says, that you are going to continue, to create images, that's a really good place to start from. Because if you're making imagery strictly based off of other people's feedback, and I think there have been moments where all of us, because of the multitude of rejections, whether it's for like grants or reviews or just even in a classroom setting, if you don't just have that basic belief, you end up creating like things that are inauthentic, and then also just probably wanting to stop altogether.
Yeah. With the reaction to this body of work, do you sometimes get concerned that you're going to be seen in a particular niche in terms of? And I think this is something that's faced by a lot of photographers of color, is that they can be pigeonholed into the photographer who only explores themes of race, which I think is unfair to a large degree. But inevitably, as an artist, you have to be sort of conscious of the fact that if you're exploring those themes, that there's a risk that other people will restrict how they see you and your work. But how much of that is a concern for you as an artist who may want to explore other ideas, other avenues of creativity?
I sort of look at it, especially as like a Black female artist, you're sort of damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. So you might as well just talk about what you want to talk about, because, it's like it's always going to be framed within that frame of reference for the most part. So there really hasn't been any topic that I've like shied away from that I felt that like I have wanted to discuss with my work. And just because I happen to be discussing it doesn't mean that there isn't something that's universal about it. And I think that that's what the shame is, the true shame of being pigeonholed sometimes and put into these neat little categories, like, oh, I'm an Asian artist and therefore I can only handle these things, and those types of things. Like, and unfortunately, like that's the world that we live in. But I don't think that it should never be a hindrance, because like if there is strong artistic merit and a strong message in what's being said, then that with certain audiences should like rise above that pigeonhole.
Mm-hmm. What doors has the press and the awareness that this project has created offered to you?
Like one interview or article is sort of like led to another, and then there's like just shows in different venues. So right now, like I've done a couple shows in America, but mainly the gallery shows that I've done have been in Canada or in England or parts of Europe, and that's sort of where those doors get opened, and also being invited to participate in different panels, or being able to go and speak at a couple of schools and talk to students either about themes of race or just just being a fine art photographer in general. Those have been very rewarding, and those are definitely the most important doors that I feel have been opened for me.
Have some of the people who looked at the work, particularly young people, have they come up to you after looking at the work and surprised you with some of the things that they've said or observed?
I wouldn't say like completely shocked me, but I think one of the most surprising that I found most recently, I was in Boston just giving a talk, and this guy came up to me afterwards and he goes, when I read the description and I went to your website and stuff, I thought you were going to be very angry. And hearing you speak today, like you just sound so, inclusive and enjoying what you're doing. And to me, that was surprising, because like I really didn't think that the tone of what I was saying was angry. This person was Asian, which isn't really that consequential to this discussion, but that I wasn't aware that it could possibly read as and it probably is like some angry political statement. It's just a statement.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
And I think especially considering the state of racial relations and racial awareness currently, I can see that a lot of people can read into the work.
Completely.
that has probably nothing to do with what your intentions were. But I wonder, like, because you've had the chance for the work to be seen outside of Canada and the United States, have you been able to discern any sort of differences culturally or as a result of people from different parts of the world looking at the work and seeing something much different than we might here in the States?
Definitely, especially like within a European context, and I'm excluding England out of that because the British have like a similar history to North America in terms of like race relations and things like that. That it's almost like there's a more I felt that like an openness, and they just sort of just kind of get it in a way that because they're not locked into these binaries of like black and white, and that's what this means, and that this is what this gets you in this society, and this is what it doesn't get you in this society. They just seem to be I think like quicker to sort of buy into this. Yes, there are like other things, and I think that also because they're coming from like colonizing countries like that. That's sort of like the proud history of these places that they're like, of course you would find traces of us there, like we were there. Versus with North America, where like there's an unwillingness on a certain level to even want to get into these discussions because of the unrest they feel that would follow those discussions. Mm-hmm. However, like whether it's conversationally or physically or whatever it is.
Have you ever taken these characters outside of the studio?
No, I haven't.
Tell me why. Why not?
I think that part of it is because I do toy with the idea of some sort of like a video like motion component to them, but because there are little tweaks that have to happen in Photoshop, mm-hmm. that it might not work as well.
Okay.
Or I haven't figured out like how to do that yet.
I'm sure that's not the first time that someone's asked you that, or has it?
Yeah. Like I almost think that it would be, I think it would also be very alarming for people. Like, it's like, sometimes people look at these images and they're just sort of like, oh, there's something very odd about that person. Yeah. And then when you look at it closer, it's like that the skin isn't translucent, like it's very opaque. Uh-huh. And there's a lot of things that are going on that like it reads as human, but like our instinctual part of our brain, there's something about it that's like off that they can't put their finger on. And I think that right now, like if I were to sort of bring it out into a more interactive environment, that it might like change a bit, like what exactly it is that I'm doing, and it would take a lot more strategy. Yeah. I would say.
So what's next for you?
I have quite a few projects that I'm working on. I'm definitely, going to continue in the vein of the self-portraiture, particularly. I've been working on a project of allegorical women, so women that represent countries in paintings and symbolism, and sort of diving into these women as like the embodiment of nations, and then how that plays into colonialism itself in terms of this mother figure, motherland, that then the colonies are sort of the children of, and the dysfunctional relationship to a degree that can occur between them, or at least like that's sort of the motivation behind that project. And then there's a few others that are just personal projects that I'm sort of wrapping up or that are ongoing that just more have to do with either my family or, traveling to the Caribbean. Wow. And things like that. So there's definitely quite a few things going on.
Well, I look forward to checking it out at some point. Well, my last question that I ask each guest is I ask them to recommend another photographer for our listeners to discover and explore, and it can be anyone, someone you've long admired or someone you've recently discovered. So who would that one photographer be and why?
Oh my gosh, there's so many. I really love Peter Hugo's work. I'm not sure if a lot of people are familiar with him. He just makes phenomenal images. He's a white South African, but he photographs like everything from like Nollywood, which is the Nigerian movie industry, and you see so many, I think in pop culture, like people borrow from his visual style. I've seen it in Beyonce videos and things like that. Like just, I would definitely recommend taking a look at his work.
Cool. Well, Stacey, thank you so much for making time for us this morning. Really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, I was really happy to get to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks again to Stacey Tyrell for joining us at The Candid Frame. To see her work, visit her site at staceytyrell.com. And please remember that you do make a huge difference to our show. Take the time today to write a review in the iTunes store. Thanks to Maddie C. Bradford from the U.S., Ewan F. from Canada, Herr Pelle Plutz from Sweden, and Daniel Rock from Canada for their 5-star reviews. You can also support the show by making a regular monthly contribution through Patreon. You can contribute amounts of $2, $5, $10 or more, or anything in between on a monthly basis and help make a big difference to the work that we're doing here at TCF. Visit patreon.com/The Candid Frame, or you'll find the link in the show notes and the Candid Frame website. I'd like to thank all the people who've recently contributed to the effort, which include Ewan Forrester, Cry Morris, and Wayne Baxter. You are really helping us to reach our goals for this year, so thank you so much. To access our complete archive of interviews, download the free Candid Frame app, available for Apple iOS, Android, and Windows. Links for each can be found in the show notes and the website at thecandidframe.com. The Candid Frame audio engineer is Martin Taylor, who you can find at theothermartintaylor.com. Our senior producer is Cynthia Parker, and our music is from Kevin MacLeod, whose royalty-free music can be found at incompetech.com. And this is Ibarian X, and this is The Candid Frame.